I know this is a controversial opinion nowadays, but I don't hate Bethesda. Yes, I played Starfield and disliked it so much that I created a series of scripted videos attempting to explain its disastrous launch and what this monumental failure exposes about the deep flaws of the Bethesda model. But for me, viewing Starfield as a disappointing failed experiment on the one hand and Bethesda hate on the other aren't synonymous with one another. If a restaurant I've satisfyingly savoured 25 times screws up on the 26th, I'd be disappointed and accordingly communicate my dissatisfaction to the management. But I wouldn't break into the kitchen, piss on the food,
I'm gonna piss on it,
and vow to never enter again with my boxers still down.
I am the king of the mountaintop.
And I didn't think this was a controversial opinion until I released a video expressing my belief that there is still hope for the Elder Scrolls 6. You see, rather than being greeted by flowers, words of admiration, and a flurry of new subscribers, I was instead blown back by a torrent of hate comments accusing me of taking a heavy dose of Bethesda copium. According to these aspiring video game intellectuals, my tentative belief in the Elder Scrolls 6 was an absurd fantasy because Bethesda is a terrible game studio that doesn't know how to produce games, and so every title it produces from now on is doomed to crash and burn. When I heard this, I was slightly surprised. It's no shock to me that the internet largely turned against Starfield and has many problems with Bethesda and its chief bullshit officer, Todd Howard.
Really happy with how the story turned out and where it goes.
But to go so far as to think Bethesda is fundamentally irredeemable seemed insane to me. Yes, current form is important and indicative of future successes in any discipline or profession, but an equally important indicator is past performance, and few studios have a record as consistent as Bethesda's. At least, that's what I thought. You see, in my mind, Bethesda is a legendary studio of a host of critically and commercially acclaimed games, a mantle few others can genuinely claim. Obviously, they faced major blips. 76 at launch was widely hated, but it was produced by a sub-studio of the main branch, and largely didn't involve Todd Howard past the line.
I'm sorry, I didn't know.
Marketing. But since I was doing a video, I thought it best for the sake of my integrity as a content creator that I actually investigate how mainline Bethesda titles received by fans, both at the time and in retrospect, just to ensure that my head really wasn't clouded by nostalgia. And it turns out I was right. Going back 20 years, every mainline pre-Starfield Bethesda game Todd Howard has overseen was not only well received by critics and fans alike, but still maintains an unusually strong, thriving community to this day. Morrowind, a game directed by the devil himself, Todd Howard, has an average Metacritic review score of 87 from critics and a 95% positive rating on Steam, and was also a tremendous financial success at the time. Oblivion likewise has a 95% positive rating from audiences on Steam and an even better Metacritic score of 94. Fallout 3, despite having a far more mixed but overall positive reception from audiences, was adored by critics who gave it an average score of 91. Skyrim, Bethesda and Todd Howard's most recent foray into the Elder Scrolls series, has a 94% positive rating from audiences on Steam and a remarkable Metacritic score of 94, and wasn't just a financial success, but a financial miracle. The initial launch not only far surpassed the record of any previous Bethesda titles, but was sustained over a decade by a series of next-gen ports and remasters that still form the backbone of a thriving fan community to this day. A community so strong that as of the recording of this video in early January 2024, Skyrim is still the 64th most played title on Steam 13 years after its release. Only one place behind The Witcher 3, a game released 4 years after and widely considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. The same could be said for the far more controversial Fallout 4. It might only have a positive Steam rating of 83% and yet has maintained such a strong player base that nearly 9 years after its release remains the 84th most played game in all of Steam. So outside of Starfield, I'd like to know where the evidence is that Todd Howard and Bethesda are just a bunch of incompetents who are so bad at creating solid RPGs that it's ridiculous to expect them to do so ever again when they have done exactly that over and over again with one notable exception. Now obviously I'm not saying Bethesda hasn't got issues that need serious redress and that the Elder Scrolls 6 will be a success. I tackled many of Bethesda's major flaws in my recent deconstruction of the Starfield shitshow. And we all know about the poor storytelling represented by the much maligned figure of Emil Pagliano, gamified side quests that rely too much on the player's omnipotence, chronically outdated engines,
Where we want to design it so it feels good on foot.
and bug-filled launches. But it's important to remember, while these flaws have always existed and were always highlighted, before Starfield, they never actually impacted player enjoyment enough to prevent wildly successful successful launches over and over again. I'm old enough to remember game journalists and online reviewers complaining about how anachronistic Fallout 4 was at its release. And yet that same game that critics complained about in 2015 is still being played more than recent releases in 2024. So I think the internet needs to seriously reckon with this dissonance between the continued success of Bethesda games and their clear disregard for the evolving standards of the industry, besides just saying Bethesda is crap, or it's a terrible studio, or it's fundamentally flawed. Now, many highlight mods. In their view, base game Skyrim or Fallout 4 were flawed games at launch that were slowly fixed over time by patches and mods, such that they became thriving communities filled with interesting fan-filled content. Now, there is undeniably some truth to this assertion. The modern community has been so influential that many saw them as the only salvation for Starfield. But I find this explanation as the sole or even significant reason for the success of these games extremely dubious on several grounds. First of all, mods cannot be completely abstracted from the engine and core gameplay loop they are dependent on. There are plenty of games with passionate modders, but few that have managed to maintain such impressive long-term traction. Just look at the recent Starfield modding controversy. Lifelong Bethesda modders who have dealt with all the bullshit Bethesda engines have thrown at them for a decade have decided to openly declare their intention to abandon Starfield because its space exploration just can't be salvaged. So it seems a bit dubious to say that Starfield was not an anomaly when it's being treated as such by those who are veterans of the Bethesda scene. But even if one accepts that mods have played an important role, this logic runs into another issue. It just doesn't match with the numbers. Evidence provided by Bethesda indicates that most people probably know more about the history of the Kanuri peoples of Nigeria than they do about content mods. In 2015, Bethesda stated that only 8% of the Skyrim audience has ever even used a mod. Less than 1% have even made one. And so while modding can enrich games to a great extent, their inclusion will only make or break the experience of the most hardcore enthusiasts. So I think to judge whether Bethesda truly deserves the hate it receives once and for all, we need to go a little deeper into what exactly continues to maintain the appeal of Bethesda titles and whether or not they can continue this for the Elder Scrolls 6. And I thought, what better way to do this than by dipping my toes back into the world of Bethesda's most acclaimed title, Skyrim. But before I continue, remember to like and subscribe. Anyways, back to this classic. Skyrim is the sort of game that, despite not really working on paper, manages to build an almost spiritual resonance with players when actually experienced. I, for one, felt this disconnect immediately when I booted up the game again. The concept to the opening is nothing special, but the way in which the calm serenity of the background music, the bountiful natural beauty of the environment, slow trodden pace of the cart, and ramblers of Brynjolf combine to form an almost symphonic rhythm to perfection is truly astounding, and anything but generic or ordinary. It didn't hurt that the upgraded graphics of the special edition rendered Skyrim's innate beauty with a precise clarity that I had not seen before, and that the game actually worked now. Gone were the game-breaking glitches, the frequent freezes, and errant crashes. My experience was smooth, and I cut through the game like a knife to warm butter. A strange experience for me, as someone who remembered Skyrim as a game about the joy of experiencing a vast wintry world with the impending threat of game-breaking bugs. So the notion that I could play the game in more than 5-minute increments was a shock to my system. But back then, and to this day, there was always so much more to Skyrim's magic than smooth performance and shiny graphics. And I felt this in full force when I finally escaped into the vast open world and rediscovered perhaps Skyrim's best feature, its unique ability to conjure a feeling of unbridled curiosity in the player. As I progressed out of the cave of Brynjolf, my mind became affected by a voracious impulse to explore every crevice, even Delphi, search through every cave, talk to every NPC, and the execution didn't disappoint. When I landed in Riverrun, I tore apart a perfect romance to help a toxic elven incel because he was good at archery, engaged in wanton robbery, murder, and all-around ludicrousness, raided a bandit hideout in a crypt, eliminated its undead host, and absorbed a dragon soul, after which I pocketed a mysterious golden claw. Playing through these opening sections of Skyrim wasn't just a great experience in the moment, but also caused memories of playing hundreds of hours of the base game on my trusty Xbox 360 to flood back into my mind. This, I believe, finally allowed me to really get to the core of what defines Bethesda's counterintuitive greatness. The unique understanding of what truly defines the player experience in an open world. Now, I know this sounds vague, but I'll explain. Bethesda has traditionally understood that above all else, the appeal of open worlds comes from their ability to offer players an enthralling escape into a fascinating realm they are free to explore, and have cared about little else. This is why the worlds created by Bethesda, despite often lacking narrative complexity, compelling combat, and stability, usually have such a distinct identity that allows them to maintain their appeal long after release. Because this one-dimensionality has enabled Bethesda to adopt an extreme attention to detail when it comes to crafting the experience of traveling through their open worlds. And that's why the terrain of Skyrim and Fallout have provided such fruitful inspiration for a vast modding community and captivated players for years and years after release. In other words, for Bethesda, the vibes are everything. And for me, this is why Starfield felt so different to play. In Starfield, they tried to do everything at once, necessarily prioritizing scope over craftsmanship, and so produced an experience that lacked their usual distinctiveness. Now, I know many of you will be skeptical. Surely Bethesda doesn't know anything about games. How else did the devil himself, Todd Howard, not understand that 76 and Starfield would flop? But I think this misunderstands who Todd Howard is and where some of his mistakes come from. I think after decades of criticism coming his way in an extremely public forum, the internet, I think it's absurd to imagine that Todd Howard isn't aware of the criticism and consciously deciding to prioritize certain features over others, regardless of fan complaints. In other words, I believe he's a conscious rule breaker, someone who knows the competition and what quality of life features they're introducing, but doesn't care as long as he believes the game feels good to play. With Starfield, this experimentation and iconoclasm perhaps went too far, but there's no real reason to suggest that the Elder Scrolls 6 will suffer the same fate. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If you didn't, well, you could actually leave some constructive criticism. I'm kind of curious.